Chapter 1, The Ghost in the Daylight. There are ghosts that do not choose the shadows as their dwelling place. They do not hide in dusty attics or wander through desolate cemeteries under the light of a full moon. There are ghosts that lurk beneath the harsh glare of the midday sun, buried shallowly under the hot asphalt and the meticulously manicured lawns of modern American suburbia. If you were to drive today to Springfield Township in Pennsylvania and stop in the neighborhood of Winmore, what you would witness is the absolute terrifying perfection of the American dream. You would see rows of townhouses with gray tiled roofs standing in regimented lines like dominoes waiting to fall. You would see polished automobiles resting silently in driveways, children cycling on pristine sidewalks, and neighbors exchanging pleasantries across white picket fences. The atmosphere radiates safety, convenience, and an overwhelming sense of normalcy. But that normalcy is a magnificent lie. Turn off your engine, step out of your car and close your eyes. Allow your mind to strip away the veneer of the 21st century. Peel back the layers of asphalt, uproot the ornamental saplings, and erase the concrete foundations of these modern homes. Turn the clock back exactly 100 years. When you open your eyes in this reimagined past, the neighborhood is gone. In its place, a massive, verdant hill rises before you, wild and majestic, stretching out like a velvet carpet woven by nature itself. And reigning upon the crest of that hill, blocking out the horizon, stands a limestone structure so white, so colossal, and so magnificent that it seems to challenge the gods themselves. It was not merely a house. It was a monster of luxury. Its name was Whitemarsh Hall. To comprehend its scale is difficult for the modern mind. Imagine a palace larger than the White House, stretching nearly 1,000 feet in length, containing 147 distinct rooms. It possessed 6 stories, 3 reaching toward the heavens and 3 plunging deep into the earth. It boasted a ballroom of such immense proportions that it could swallow 1,000 guests. A place where the strains of the waltz once echoed endlessly through the night. Whitemarsh Hall was not constructed to be a shelter from the elements. It was built to be a manifesto. It was a declaration carved in Indiana limestone and gilded in 22-karat gold, screaming to the world that here resided the uncrowned kings of America. It was the ultimate symbol of the Gilded Age, a sanctuary where U.S. presidents, European princes, and the industrial titans who held the destiny of the world in their hands once raised their glasses to the eternal permanence of wealth. But today, if you wander through the communal park of this residential development, you might stumble upon a strange white rock jutting out from the weeds. Or, if you look closely into a stranger's backyard, you might discern the fragment of a Roman column, broken in half and utilized as a garden bench. These are the only skeletal remains left of a dinosaur that has gone extinct. How does a palace that was christened the American Versailles, a structure that consumed the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars, simply evaporate from the face of the earth? How does a dynasty that possessed financial power greater than the treasuries of small nations end in total oblivion and ruin? The story I am about to tell you is not merely architectural history. It is a modern Greek tragedy. It is a story about hubris. It is a testament to humanity's desperate desire to build heaven on earth, only to eventually realize that every heaven requires a gatekeeper, and hell is always waiting in the basement. Chapter 2, Philadelphia 1910, the workshop of the world. To truly understand the fate of Whitemarsh Hall, we cannot begin with its splendid beauty or its cold marble halls. We must begin with the heat, with the stench of coal dust, and with the frenetic ambition of Philadelphia in the early 20th century. In 1910, Philadelphia was not the city of quiet historical monuments we know today. It was the workshop of the world. If New York was the financial brain of the United States, Philadelphia was its brawn, the muscle pumping blood into the veins of a young economy. Imagine a city permanently shrouded in a veil of man-made twilight. This was not the mist of water vapor, but the smoke of industry. Black soot billowed from the chimneys of thousands of textile mills, steel foundries, and oil refineries. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur, sweat, and money. The soundscape of the city was a ceaseless mechanical symphony, the roar of locomotives hauling cargo to the docks, the rhythmic pounding of steam hammers, the grinding of gears. In this industrial purgatory, wealth was being generated at a velocity human history had never before witnessed. This was the era that birthed the robber barons. Who were they? They were the men who held the arteries of the nation: steel, oil, railroads, and banking. Unlike the aristocracy of Europe, men who inherited titles like duke or earl from their ancestors and lived in decaying castles, the American robber barons largely rose from the common clay. They climbed to the summit through ruthlessness, sharp intellect, and an uncanny ability to see order in chaos. They were richer than kings. Their personal fortunes were vast enough to purchase entire countries. But deep within their souls, these powerful men carried a psychological wound, a profound and incurable insecurity. In the eyes of the old world elite across the ocean, they were despised. The aristocracy of England and France viewed them with sneering contempt, branding them nouveau riche new money. They were seen as loud, crude, gaudy, and devoid of culture. They were viewed as barbarians attempting to purchase respectability. That scorn gnawed at their pride, and to retaliate, to mask that insecurity, they initiated the most insane architectural arms race in history. They decided that if they could not have royal blood, they would live like royalty. They did not build homes, they built temples to their own egos. They dispatched fleets of ships to Italy to strip the mountains of white Carrara marble. They hired armies of foresters in England to fell ancient oak forests for their wall paneling. They went so far as to purchase entire interiors of crumbling French chateaux, dismantling them brick by brick, curtain by curtain, packing them into crates, and shipping them back to America to be reassembled like gigantic puzzles. America in the 1,910 seconds became a grand stage, where imitation castles sprang up from the earth, larger and more opulent than their originals in Europe. And in this race to incinerate money, one man stood above them all. A small, quiet man who preferred the shadows of the ledger to the spotlight, but who held the keys to America's vault. His name was Edward Townsend Stotesbury, and he was about to do the impossible. Chapter 3, The Keeper of the Ledger. To understand the house, one must first understand the wallet that paid for it, and that wallet belonged to a man who was, in every physical sense, entirely unremarkable. Edward Townsend Stotesbury was not a man who commanded a room with his size. Standing barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a stiff white collar and a neatly groomed mustache that twitched when he was deep in thought, Ned Stotesbury looked more like a meticulously organized library clerk than a titan of industry. But in the world of 1,910, physical size was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the weight of one's signature. And Ned Stotesbury's signature weighed more than the steel battleships sitting in the Philadelphia Naval Yard. He was the senior partner of J.P. Morgan and Company in Philadelphia. For the uninitiated, J.P. Morgan was not merely a bank. It was the central nervous system of the American economy. Before the Federal Reserve had fully established its power, it was the House of Morgan that bailed out the U.S. government during panics, that financed the railroads, which stitched the continent together, and that organized the steel trusts which built the skyscrapers of Manhattan. Ned was the gatekeeper of this colossal wealth. He was a man of profound contradictions. A living paradox wrapped in a tailored suit. On the trading floor, he was a predator cold, calculating, and possessed of a terrifying memory for figures. He could recall the balance sheets of a dozen railroad companies down to the last decimal point. He worked with a Calvinist zeal, arriving at his desk at the Drexel building before the sun rose and leaving long after the gas lamps had been lit on Chestnut Street. To him, idleness was a sin, and profit was a form of prayer. Yet, outside the office, the predator vanished, replaced by a peculiar, almost childlike, eccentric. Ned loved to play the drums. It was his secret passion. At society parties, the most powerful banker in America could often be found sitting behind a drum kit, happily keeping the beat for the orchestra, his eyes shining with a joy that his balance sheets never gave him. He was a man who would give millions to charity without blinking. Yet he was possessed by a strange, compulsive frugality in his private life. He was known to wander the hallways of his townhouse, turning off lights in empty rooms, muttering about the cost of electricity. He would reuse paper clips. He would inspect the grocery bills. He was a man who had conquered the material world but seemed unsure of how to enjoy it. He had the money of a pharaoh, but the soul of an accountant. He needed a catalyst, something, or someone to unlock the ambition that lay dormant beneath his frugal exterior. He needed a reason to spend. And in 1912, he found her. Chapter 4, The Woman Who Wanted the World. If Ned Stotesbury was the wallet, Eva Roberts Cromwell was the will. When she entered Ned's life, she was a widow, twice over, but she did not wear her widowhood like a shroud. She wore it like armor. Eva was a force of nature disguised in silk and lace. She was not a classic beauty in the delicate, fragile sense of the Victorian era. Her beauty was formidable. It was the beauty of a statuesque matriarch, commanding and absolute. Eva was born into wealth, but she was not content with mere comfort. She possessed a hunger that food could not satiate. It was a hunger for status in the rigid, stratified atmosphere of the Gilded Age. Social standing was a blood sport. New York had Mrs. Astor, the gatekeeper of the 400, the list of the only people worth knowing. Philadelphia had its own ancient Quaker families. Insular and quiet, Eva looked at these hierarchies and decided she did not want to merely join them. She wanted to crush them. She understood the theatrical nature of power better than anyone. She knew that in America, you are not who you are born as, you are who you pretend to be, provided you can afford the costume. And Eva loved the costume. She draped herself in diamonds, not just a ring or a necklace, but ropes of pearls that hung to her waist, tiaras that rivaled the Romanovs, and emeralds the size of pigeon eggs. When she walked into a ballroom, she didn't just glitter, she blazed. She moved with the posture of a woman who expected the seas to part before her. But she had a problem. Her stage was too small. The Stotesbury townhouse in Rittenhouse Square, though luxurious by normal standards, was a cage for a woman of her ambition. It was cramped. It was urban. It was surrounded by neighbors. A queen cannot rule from a row house. A queen requires a palace. A queen requires a domain where her word is law and her view is unblocked by the chimney pots of lesser mortals. She looked at her new husband, the quiet drummer banker with the limitless credit line. She saw in him not just a partner, but an instrument. He had the means to realize her wildest fantasies. If only he could be pushed. And push him she did. She whispered into his ear a seduction far more potent than romance. She seduced him with the promise of immortality. She convinced him that his money was worthless if it died in a bank vault, It had to be transformed into stone, into art, into a legacy that would bear the Stotesbury name long after their bodies had turned to dust. Chapter 5, The Pact with the Devil. The decision to build Whitemarsh Hall was not made in a boardroom. It was likely made in the quiet intimacy of a carriage ride, or over a dinner table set with silver. It was a Faustian pact. Eva would provide the vision, the taste, and the social strategy. Ned would provide the checkbook. They did not want to build in the city. The city was dirty, crowded, and democratic. They wanted to escape to the country, to the rolling hills north of Philadelphia, where the air was clean and the land was vast. They scouted a location in Winmore, a wild, rugged expanse of high ground known as Whitemarsh. It was perfect. It was elevated, offering commanding views of the Whitemarsh Valley. It was isolated enough to be a private kingdom, yet close enough to the city for Ned to commute to his bank. But the scale of what they proposed was terrifying. They did not sit down to sketch a home. They sat down to redraw the map of Pennsylvania. They talked of leveling hills. They talked of diverting streams. They talked of a house that would require its own power plant, its own water system, and its own fire department. To execute this madness, they needed a co-conspirator. They needed an architect who was as arrogant as they were. They found him in Horace Trumbauer. Trumbauer was a local Philadelphia boy who had dropped out of school at 16, yet he possessed a genius for interpreting the desires of the super-rich. He understood that men like Stotesbury didn't want innovation, they wanted validation. They wanted architecture that screamed old money, even if the money was brand new. When Ned and Eva laid out their requirements to Trumbauer, the architect didn't blink. "You want Versailles," he might have said, studying the terrain. "We can do better than Versailles. We will build it with American steel and American plumbing." The budget was open-ended. There was no ceiling. Ned Stotesbury, the man who saved paperclips, picked up his fountain pen. With a single signature, he authorized the destruction of a massive fortune. At that moment, the first shovel had not yet struck the earth. But the tragedy was already written. They were about to build a house so large that it would eventually consume the very fortune that created it. They were building a golden anchor, and they were about to tie it around their own necks. The die was cast. The era of Whitemarsh had begun. Chapter 6, The Architect of Impossible Dreams. To build a monument that defies logic, you need an architect who does not believe in limits. Horace Trumbauer was such a man. In the pantheon of American architecture, Trumbauer was an anomaly. He was not a polished intellectual from the Ivy League. He was a reserved, almost shy man who had started his career as an errand boy at the age of 16. He possessed no formal degree, yet he wielded a pencil with the precision of a surgeon and the imagination of an emperor. Trumbauer was the prince of the Gilded Age. He understood the psychological needs of the robber barons better than they understood themselves. He knew that men like Stotesbury didn't want their homes to look new. They wanted them to look inevitable. They wanted structures that felt as though they had stood on the earth for centuries, imparting a sense of ancient legitimacy to fortunes that were barely a generation old. For Whitemarsh Hall, Trumbauer envisioned a hybrid. He looked to the great Georgian manor houses of England for solidity, and he looked to the Petit Trianon of Versailles for grace. But he scaled it up to American proportions. He worked in tandem with his chief designer, Julian Abele, a brilliant African-American architect whose contributions were often whispered rather than shouted in the racially segregated society of the time. Together, they drafted a blueprint that was less a house and more a civic institution. The plans called for a steel skeleton, riveted together like a skyscraper, ensuring the house would be fireproof and indestructible. It was to be clad in the finest Indiana limestone, a material chosen for its ability to glow white in the sunlight and turn a soft, ghostly gray under the moon. When Stotesbury saw the final drawings, he did not see a price tag. He saw a mirror. The rigid symmetry, the imposing columns, the sheer, unyielding weight of the stone, it was exactly how he saw himself. It was a fortress of finance made manifest. Chapter 7, The War Against Nature. In 1916, the silence of the Windmore Hills was shattered. The construction of Whitemarsh Hall began not with a trowel, but with an invasion. An army of laborers descended upon the 300 acres of rolling farmland. They brought with them the heavy artillery of the industrial age, steam shovels that belched black smoke, horse-drawn graders, and dynamite. The ambition of the project required a war against geography itself. The Stotesburys were not content with the land as God had made it. The hill was too round. They wanted it flat. The valleys were too deep. They wanted them filled. Imagine the sensory assault of those early months. The air, once sweet with the scent of wild grass, was now thick with the acrid smell of burning coal and the metallic tang of overturned earth. Thousands of tons of soil were shifted, terraforming the Pennsylvania countryside into a rigid geometric plateau worthy of a French king. To choreograph this landscape, they hired Jacques Graeber, the most famous garden designer in France. Graeber looked at the raw, red clay of Pennsylvania and saw a canvas. He envisioned a grand allée, a mile-long axis of gardens, fountains, and statuary that would lead the eye from the house to the horizon, creating an illusion of infinite dominion. It was a logistical ballet of unprecedented scale. A dedicated railroad spur was built just to haul materials to the site. Day and night, trains arrived carrying steel beams, bags of cement, and rough-cut stone. The ground shook with the impact of progress. It was a scene of chaos, mud, and noise, out of which a terrifying order was slowly beginning to rise. Chapter 8, the ocean liners and the U-boats. But the true audacity of Whitemarsh Hall lay not in what was built, but when it was built. While the foundation stones were being laid in Philadelphia, the world across the Atlantic was ending. World War I was raging. The fields of France were being churned into bloody mud. The great cathedrals of Europe were under artillery fire. Yet, in a display of surreal detachment, the Stotesburys continued to shop. They were not merely building a house, they were looting the history of Europe to furnish it. As U-boats patrolled the icy waters of the Atlantic, hunting for Allied merchant ships, ocean liners were risking the crossing to deliver luxury goods to the Stotesbury estate. Consider the absurdity of the manifests. While ships carrying ammunition and medical supplies were being torpedoed, crates containing 18th century French mirrors were being carefully loaded in Le Havre, while the forests of the Argonne were being destroyed by machine gun fire. Antique wood paneling was being stripped from Parisian townhouses and shipped to Pennsylvania. There were moments of genuine peril. Shipments were delayed. Insurance premiums for the cargo skyrocketed. There were rumors of a consignment of marble statues sitting on a dock in Liverpool, waiting for a break in the German blockade. But the materials arrived. The limestone from Indiana came by rail. The marble from Italy came by sea. The tapestries from Belgium came through secret channels. It was the ultimate expression of the robber baron philosophy. The world might burn, nations might fall, and empires might crumble, but the construction of the palace must not be delayed. The war was a distant inconvenience, a logistical hurdle to be overcome by the application of more money. By 1920, as the smoke cleared over a devastated Europe, Whitemarsh Hall stood, finished. It was pristine, white, and untouched by the horrors of the age. It was a capsule of the old world, resurrected in the new, built by men who believed their wealth made them immune to the tragedies of history. They were wrong, of course, but standing before the completed limestone giant in the spring of 1921, it was very hard to see the cracks in the foundation. Chapter 9, Anatomy of the Leviathan. To the casual observer standing on the lawn, Whitemarsh Hall appeared to be a structure of solid masonry, a throwback to the great stone castles of the Renaissance. But this was an illusion. Beneath its limestone skin beat the heart of a modern industrial machine. If you were to X-ray Whitemarsh Hall, you would not see the timber framing of a traditional home. You would see the skeleton of a skyscraper. Horace Trumbauer had constructed a massive grid of heavy structural steel, riveted together with the same technology used to build the dreadnought battleships of the U.S. Navy. This steel cage served two purposes. First, it rendered the house virtually fireproof, a primary obsession of the super-rich who feared losing their art collections to an errant spark. Second, it allowed the house to defy gravity. The steel beams carried the immense weight of the limestone cladding, allowing for cavernous interior spaces that required no visible support columns. The Great Hall felt less like a room and more like a suspended void. But a body needs blood to survive. And the blood of Whitemarsh Hall was coal. Deep in the sub-basement lay the mechanical organs of the estate, a massive heating plant rivaling that of a small hospital, roared 24 hours a day. It was a voracious beast, consuming 2 tons of anthracite coal every single day during the winter months. The heat was pumped through miles of brass piping hidden within the walls, ensuring that even when the Pennsylvania blizzards howled outside, the temperature in the ballroom never dipped below 70 degrees. The nervous system of the house was equally advanced, at a time when many rural Americans were still reading by kerosene lamps. Whitemarsh Hall was a temple of electricity. Miles of copper wire were threaded through the steel skeleton, powering thousands of incandescent bulbs that banished the night. Perhaps the most impressive feature was the telephone exchange. The estate possessed its own private switchboard, manned by operators who did nothing but route calls between the 147 rooms. Eva Stotesbury could pick up a receiver in her boudoir and be instantly connected to the head gardener a mile away in the greenhouse, or to her husband's office in downtown Philadelphia. It was a closed-circuit kingdom, a technological marvel wrapped in the disguise of an 18th century palace. Chapter 10, Jacques Ribert and the Geometry of Power. A jewel of this magnitude required a setting. The Stotesburys did not want their palace to sit upon a wild, untamed hill. They believed that nature, like people, should be disciplined, organized, and made to serve a higher aesthetic purpose. Enter Jacques Greber. Greber was the undisputed master of the French formal garden. He looked at the rolling landscape of Winmore and decided to impose upon it the rigid logic of geometry. He designed the estate not as a garden, but as a series of outdoor rooms. The centerpiece was the Grande Allée, a breathtaking axis of green stretching for a mile from the terrace of the house to the horizon. It was a manipulation of perspective, a visual trick designed to draw the eye toward infinity. Flanking this great avenue were parterres of clipped boxwood, arranged in intricate embroidery patterns that mirrored the carpets inside the house. Statues of Greek gods and goddesses, carved from white marble, were positioned like sentries along the gravel paths. But the soul of the garden was water. Greber engineered a complex hydraulic system to power a series of fountains that rivaled the displays of Europe. The Seahorse Fountain, a magnificent sculpture group, sprayed jets of water high into the air, creating a constant soothing white noise that masked the sounds of the outside world. There was a belvedere, a stone lookout tower perched at the edge of the property, offering views of the valley below. There were rose gardens containing thousands of blooms, arranged by color to create a living rainbow. It was a triumph of man over nature. There was no chaos here. No weeds, no disorder. Every blade of grass was accounted for. Every tree was pruned into submission. It was a landscape that whispered a seductive lie that with enough money, even the earth itself could be brought to heal. Standing on the limestone terrace in 1921, looking out over the illuminated fountains and the perfectly symmetrical trees, one could be forgiven for thinking that this perfection would last forever. It felt permanent. It felt eternal. But gardens are living things. They require constant vigilance. And the moment the gardeners stopped fighting, the wildness would be waiting at the gates, ready to reclaim its territory. Chapter 11, The Great Hall and the Gods on the Walls. To step through the massive bronze doors of Whitemarsh Hall was not merely an act of entering a residence. It was an act of submission. You were crossing a border into a sovereign nation where Edward and Eva Stotesbury were the absolute monarchs. You found yourself standing in the Great Hall. To call it a hall is a linguistic failure. It was a limestone canyon. The ceiling soared 2 stories high, supported by massive, fluted pilasters that echoed the temples of ancient Rome. The air here was different. It was always cool, possessing a specific, heavy silence that smelled faintly of lemon wax, old parchment, and dried lavender. It was a silence that demanded you lower your voice to a whisper. This room was the physical manifestation of Ned Stotesbury's insecurity and his solution to it. He knew that his money was new, minted in the smoke of the 20th century. So he used this room to purchase the one thing he didn't have: time. He filled the space with history. He lined the walls with goblin tapestries woven in the 1700s, depicting scenes of mythical hunts and courtly love. If you looked closely, you could see threads dyed with pigments that no longer exist, colors that had faded under the gaze of French kings before they ever met the eyes of an American banker. But the true rulers of the Great Hall were the portraits. Above the stone fireplaces hung the faces of the British aristocracy, masterpieces painted by Romney, Lawrence, and Hopner. These were not Stotesbury ancestors. They were the dukes and duchesses of England, long dead. Their painted eyes stared down from the walls with a look of eternal judgment, watching these American newcomers play at being royalty. It was a peculiar form of psychological theater. Ned Stotesbury surrounded himself with rented ancestors to legitimize his fortune. Standing in the center of that hall, dwarfed by the scale of the architecture and the gaze of history, a guest couldn't help but feel insignificant. And that was exactly the point. Chapter 12, The Ballroom, the Gilded Heart. If the Great Hall was the imposing body of the house, the ballroom was its beating, golden heart. This was Eva Stotesbury's domain. If the rest of the house was a tribute to masculine stone and steel, this room was a symphony of feminine power, modeled after the grand salons of Louis XV. It was designed to be the most beautiful room in America. There was no stone here. The walls were clad in boiserie, intricate wood paneling carved by master craftsmen in Paris, shipped across the Atlantic, and reassembled like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Every curve, every floral motif, every delicate molding was gilded with 22-karat gold leaf. It was applied so thinly that a heavy breath could blow it away. Yet it shone with a warmth that electric light could never replicate. The floor was a marvel of hidden engineering. It was laid in a parquet de Versailles pattern, an intricate weave of oak, But beneath the wood lay a secret system of springs and felt. The floor was sprung, designed to give way slightly under pressure, allowing dancers to waltz for 6 hours without fatigue. It was a floor that breathed with the music. And then there were the mirrors. Eva understood the physics of vanity. She installed 10 floor-to-ceiling mirrors along the eastern wall, positioned directly opposite the windows. At night, the room transformed. 3 massive rock crystal chandeliers, each weighing half a ton, were illuminated. In the early days, they held hundreds of beeswax candles. Later, they held electric bulbs that mimicked the flicker of flame. When the light hit the crystals, it shattered into 1,000 rainbows. The mirrors caught this light, along with the glitter of diamonds and the sheen of silk dresses, and bounced it back and forth in an endless loop. It created an infinity effect. A gathering of 500 guests was optically multiplied into a legion of millions. It turned the room into a boundless universe of golden light, a place where the boundaries of the room seemed to dissolve. Standing in the center of the swirl, with the orchestra playing and the champagne flowing, it was easy to believe that this golden afternoon would never fade into twilight. But mirrors are dangerous things. They show you exactly what you want to see, until the moment they shatter. Chapter 13, The City Beneath the Floorboards. However, perfection is not natural. Perfection is a manufactured product. And like any factory, Whitemarsh Hall required a brutal industrial engine to keep it running, while Eva Stotesbury played the role of the benevolent queen in the sunlight. A shadow world existed just beneath the soles of her silk shoes. To understand the true scale of the estate, one must descend down the narrow service stairs, past the green baize doors that muffled sound, into the sub-basement. Here, the architecture changed. The limestone and gold leaf vanished, replaced by glazed white brick and cold concrete. This was the digestive tract of the beast. Horace Trumbauer, the architect, had designed a subterranean city beneath the estate. The most remarkable feature was a massive service tunnel, wide enough to accommodate commercial delivery trucks. It burrowed deep into the hillside, allowing vehicles carrying sides of beef, blocks of ice, and tons of anthracite coal to drive directly into the bowels of the earth without ever being seen from the gardens above. Imagine the sensory assault of this underground world. While the upstairs smelled of hothouse orchids and expensive perfume, the basement smelled of coal dust, harsh lye soap, and roasting meat. The kitchen was not a domestic space. It was a foundry. The walls were tiled from floor to ceiling in white subway tiles, designed to be scrubbed down daily. The floor was red quarry tile, hard and unforgiving. Dominating the room was a cast iron stove nearly 20 feet long, a black monster that radiated heat 24 hours a day. Here, a brigade of chefs worked in a chaotic ballet. They stood amidst clouds of steam, shouting orders over the clang of copper pots. Hundreds of copper vessels hung from the ceiling, each one requiring daily polishing with vinegar and salt until it shone like a mirror. Even though Mr. Stotesbury would never step foot downstairs to see them, it was a place of noise, heat, and ceaseless labor. A mechanized underworld that existed solely to ensure that the silence upstairs remained unbroken. Chapter 14, The Invisible Machine. If the basement was the engine, the servants were the gears. Maintaining Whitemarsh Hall required a regiment that rivaled a military platoon. Outside, 70 gardeners fought a daily war against nature to keep the hedges geometric and the lawns resembling green velvet. Inside, the hierarchy was even more rigid. 40 staff members, butlers, footmen, valets, chambermaids, and scullery maids lived within the walls. They operated under a strict code of invisibility. The architecture of the house conspired to aid them. Whitemarsh Hall was riddled with a secret labyrinth, a network of service staircases, hidden corridors built within the thickness of the walls, and concealed doors cut seamlessly into the paneling. A maid carrying a pile of dirty linens could travel from the third-floor guest suites to the basement laundry without ever being glimpsed by a guest. They were ghosts in their own home. Their duty was to appear only when a bell was rung, and to vanish the moment the glass was filled. The hierarchy below stairs was as stratified as the society above. At the top sat the butler and the housekeeper, the generals of this domestic army. They had their own private dining room and were served by lower-ranking staff. At the bottom were these scullery maids, young women who spent their days with their hands submerged in scalding soapy water, scrubbing the grease off the china plates that the Stotesburys had dined upon. The tasks performed here bordered on the obsessive. In the silver room, a footman spent 12 hours a day doing nothing but polishing the family's vast collection of sterling silver, rubbing it until his fingers cramped to ensure that not a single fingerprint would mar the surface. In the ironing room, a specific maid was tasked with ironing the morning newspapers, drying the ink so that it would not smudge Mr. Stotesbury's white gloves when he read the financial reports. This grueling choreography served a singular purpose: the illusion of magic. Upstairs, dinner appeared on the table as if summoned by a sorcerer. The rooms were always perfectly warm. The sheets were always crisp. The guests never saw the sweat. They never heard the shouting of the chef or the rumble of the coal trucks. Whitemarsh Hall was a theater. The Stotesburys were the actors. The guests were the audience. And down in the tunnels, the stagehands were breaking their backs to ensure the play never stopped. Chapter 15, The Night of 1,000 Roses. The 1,920 seconds did not merely arrive at Whitemarsh Hall. They exploded in a shower of sparks. To understand the atmosphere of this decade, one must realize that for people like the Stotesburys, reality had temporarily ceased to apply. This was the era of the Roaring Twenties, a period of intoxicating, feverish optimism where the stock market knew only one direction up and the party was legally mandated never to end. Whitemarsh Hall became the epicenter of this American delirium. And the defining moment, the single night that captured the soul of this era, was the debutante ball of 1922. It wasn't just a social gathering, it was a piece of performance art funded by infinite credit. Eva Stotesbury decided to transform the estate into a fantasy land, a living dreamscape. As dusk fell, the massive wrought iron gates at the bottom of the hill were suddenly outlined in fire. Thousands of small electric bulbs traced the intricate scrollwork, signaling to the world that the gates of Olympus were open. As guests arrived, they didn't just walk into a house, they walked into a garden brought indoors. The Great Hall was filled with literal truckloads of American Beauty roses and rare orchids, imported from hothouses across the state. The scent was so overpowering, so thick and sweet, that it bordered on narcotic. The auditory landscape was equally overwhelming. 3 separate orchestras played simultaneously in different wings of the house. No matter where you stood, whether on the terrace or in the library, the air was filled with the syncopated, rebellious rhythms of jazz. And then there was the liquor. This was the height of Prohibition. Alcohol was illegal in the United States. But at Whitemarsh Hall, the laws of the common man did not apply. Champagne flowed like water from a mountain spring. Cases of vintage French wine, smuggled through the same channels that brought the art, were poured into crystal coupes that sparkled under the chandeliers. The cost of operating this machine for a single night was astronomical. Historians estimate that the floral budget alone could have purchased a modest home for a working-class family. But nobody cared about the math. Not in 1922. The guests danced on the sprung floor of the ballroom, spinning faster and faster, caught in a collective trance. They were dancing on the rim of a volcano, and the view was spectacular. The music was loud enough to drown out the warning signs. They believed that they had conquered economics just as they had conquered the landscape. They believed the summer would last forever. Chapter 16, The Court of the Titans. But Whitemarsh Hall was more than just a playground for the frivolous. It was the unofficial capital of the United States for 10 glorious years. The limestone palace served as the meeting ground for the men who actually ran the world. If you were to stand on the limestone portico on a Tuesday afternoon in 1925, you would witness a parade of power that has rarely been equaled since the driveway, a mile-long ribbon of asphalt, became a runway for the most expensive machinery on Earth. Duesenbergs, Packards, and Rolls-Royces, their polished chrome gleaming in the Pennsylvania sun, would glide up to the front steps. Out of these cars stepped the Titans. Henry Ford walked these hallways. The man who put the world on wheels would stand beneath the portraits of 18th century dukes, discussing the future of the assembly line while sipping tea from delicate china. Thomas Edison sat in the library. The Wizard of Menlo Park, the man who illuminated the world, marveled at the sheer scale of the electrical grid required to power Stotesbury's folly. Even royalty came to pay homage. The future King of England found himself sleeping in the guest wing, perhaps finding the accommodations at Whitemarsh slightly more comfortable, and certainly warmer, than Buckingham Palace. The conversations that took place in the library of Whitemarsh Hall shaped the trajectory of the 20th century. Deals were struck between steel magnates and railroad tycoons that determined the price of infrastructure for millions of Americans. Political alliances were forged over cigars and brandy. It was a closed loop, a hermetically sealed world where the rich spoke only to the rich, protected by the stone walls of the estate. Eva Stotesbury sat at the center of this web, the queen bee of American society. She had achieved her goal. She had forced the world to come to her. When she looked out over her manicured gardens, past the fountains and the statues, she didn't just see land. She saw a kingdom that was secure, impregnable, and eternal. But she was looking at the wrong horizon, far away. In the trading pits of Wall Street, the ticker tape machines were beginning to shudder. The gears of the economy were grinding, and a storm was gathering that no amount of limestone walls could keep out. Chapter 17, the day the ticker stopped. But seasons change, and sometimes winter arrives with a violence that shatters the world. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the volcano finally erupted. In the financial districts of New York and Philadelphia, the ticker tape machines, which had been singing the song of endless profit for a decade, suddenly began to vomit out a death sentence. Panic swept through the trading floors like a contagion. Men who had woken up as millionaires went to bed owing money they could never repay. Fortunes that had taken 3 generations to build evaporated in 3 hours, dissolving like sugar in hot tea. For Ned Stotesbury, the crash was a psychological guillotine. He was 80 years old. He had spent his entire life building a fortress of finance, believing it was impregnable. Now, sitting in his office at J.P. Morgan, he watched helplessly as the foundation of that fortress turned to sand. He did not go bankrupt. His sheer volume of assets, the railroads, the steel trusts, the bonds, prevented total ruin. But the river of liquid cash required to feed the monster of Whitemarsh Hall suddenly dried up into a trickle. The psychological impact was far worse than the financial one. The crash broke the spell. The illusion of eternal summer was over. The guests who had populated the ballroom were now fighting for their financial lives. The limousines stopped coming. The phone, which used to ring constantly with social invitations, sat silent on its hook. The party was over, and the hangover was about to begin. Chapter 18. The silence spreads. 1,930 seconds at Whitemarsh Hall were defined not by a sudden explosion, but by a slow, insidious silence. It was a period of strangulation. The Great Depression settled over the estate like a heavy gray blanket. The change in the house was terrifyingly steady. First, the flowers disappeared. The American Beauty roses, which used to be replaced daily, were changed weekly, then monthly, until they vanished altogether, replaced by silk imitations or empty porcelain vases gathering dust. Then, the heat died, to save on the astronomical cost of coal. Entire wings of the house were shut down. Doors to the guest suites were locked, and the furniture inside was draped in white sheets, looking like ghosts standing in the gloom. The gold room, the blue room, the library's spaces designed for laughter and warmth became cold. Dark storage lockers, the army of servants began to vanish. It started with the undergardeners, then the second footman, then the kitchen maids. The staff of 70 shrank to 50, then 30 outside. The meticulously manicured gardens began to show the first signs of rebellion. Weeds poked through the gravel paths. The boxwood hedges grew shaggy and unkempt. The great seahorse fountain, once a shimmering display of hydraulic power, was turned off to save electricity. The basin filled with dead leaves and stagnant water. Eva Stotesbury, the queen who had built this stage, tried desperately to keep the play going. She still dressed for dinner every night, wearing her famous emeralds, sitting at the end of a 40-foot dining table, but there were no guests. It was just her and Ned, two elderly figures eating in a cavernous room that was slowly growing colder. The atmosphere of the house shifted from celebration to defense. Whitemarsh Hall was no longer a palace, it was a bunker. They were hiding inside, hoping the storm outside would pass. But this wasn't a storm. It was an ice age, and the cold was just beginning to seep into the bones of the house. Chapter 19. The Death of the King. The late 1,930 seconds at Whitemarsh Hall were not defined by events, but by a suffocating, heavy stasis. As the Great Depression ground the outside world into dust, inside the limestone gates, time seemed to slow down and curdle. The estate became a golden cage for two elderly people who were slowly realizing that they had built a monument to a future that would never arrive. Edward Stotesbury, the man whose nod once moved markets, was now a shadow. He was 89 years old. The sharp, calculating eyes that had stared down J. P. Morgan were now clouded and watery. He spent his final years engaging in a heartbreaking routine. He would wander the vast, echoing corridors of his home, a small, frail figure lost in the limestone canyons he had paid for. Servants would find him sitting alone in the library, staring at books he couldn't read, or gazing out the window at the fountain that had been turned off to save money. He was the captain of a Titanic that hadn't hit an iceberg, but was simply running out of fuel in the middle of the ocean. On May 16, 1938, the captain finally left the ship. Edward Stotesbury died, and with his last breath, the true soul of Whitemarsh Hall evaporated. His funeral was the final, gasping breath of the Gilded Age. It was a spectacle of black crepe and solemn faces. The elite of Philadelphia and New York returned one last time, their limousines winding up the long driveway like a funeral procession of beetles. But as they stood in the great hall, murmuring their condolences, they weren't just mourning a man, they were mourning an era. They looked around at the peeling paint and the corners of the ceiling, at the understaffed gardens visible through the windows, and they saw their own mortality reflected in the stone. They realized that the world of tax-free fortunes and endless servants was dead. When the last car drove away, the silence that returned to the house was heavier than before. Eva Stotesbury was left behind. She was the sole survivor of a shipwreck, stranded on an island of limestone. Chapter 20, The Queen's Farewell. Imagine the sheer physical weight of that solitude. Eva was a widow living alone in a house of 147 rooms. At night, she would sit in her private suite, surrounded by photographs of dead friends and parties that happened 20 years ago. The silence of the house was not peaceful. It was predatory. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window panes sounded like the house whispering to her. She began to do the math, the cruel, unforgiving arithmetic of survival. Without Ned's income, the estate was a financial black hole. The property taxes alone were devouring her trust fund. The heating bills were burning through her savings. She realized that she was no longer the mistress of Whitemarsh Hall, she was its janitor. She was paying a fortune to maintain a museum that nobody visited, guarding a treasure that nobody wanted. In her heart, Eva knew the truth. The house had won. It had outlived its creator. And now it was consuming his widow. The year was 1942. The decision was made. It was time to surrender. The process of leaving was like a funeral rite. The great chandeliers were lowered on their chains and wrapped in heavy canvas bags. The French furniture, the Louis XV chairs and the gilded tables were covered in white dust sheets. The rooms looked like a gathering of ghosts. The massive iron gates were locked with heavy chains. There is a haunting story told about her departure. As her car drove down the long driveway for the final time, Eva Stotesbury did not look back. She sat stoic and upright in the back seat, refusing to let the servants see her cry. But as the iron gates clanged shut behind her, sealing the tomb, she knew she was leaving a part of her soul trapped behind those walls. She moved to a smaller estate, taking her jewelry and her memories with her. She left behind a fully furnished palace, complete with art on the walls and china in the cupboards, waiting for a master who would never return. The queen had abdicated, the castle was empty, and the long night of Whitemarsh Hall had truly begun. Chapter 21, The Fortress of Beauty. History has a strange sense of irony. Just as Whitemarsh Hall was preparing to die, the world caught fire again. In 1941, the United States entered World War II. Across the ocean, the cities of Europe were being pulverized by the Luftwaffe. Museums in London and Paris were scrambling to hide their treasures in caves and mines. In New York City, the directors of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Met, looked at the sky in fear. They knew that if German bombers ever reached the East Coast, Manhattan would be the first target. They needed a hiding place. They needed a fortress, a place that was fireproof, built of steel and stone, secluded from the city, yet large enough to hold the history of Western civilization. They looked at the empty, hulking shell of Whitemarsh Hall, and they saw a bunker. In 1942, a surreal transformation took place. The refugees of war moved in, but these were not human refugees. Trucks arrived in the dead of night, carrying crates marked with red stamps, fragile. The limestone palace was militarized. The grand French windows, designed to let in the golden afternoon sun, were boarded up with heavy steel shutters. The rose gardens were patrolled by armed guards with German shepherds. The temperature and humidity inside were strictly controlled. not for the comfort of people, but for the survival of canvas and oil paint. Whitemarsh Hall became the greatest secret art gallery in history. Walk with me through this phantom museum. Imagine standing in the great ballroom. The music is gone. The dancers are gone. The mirrors are dark. Instead, the floor is packed with thousands of wooden crates. Inside those crates sat the masterpieces of the human race. A Raphael Madonna slept in the dark next to a fireplace where debutantes once warmed their hands. Paintings by Goya, Rembrandt, and Vermeer sat silently in the scullery. Medieval armor stood guard in the guest bedrooms. The priceless Chippendale furniture of the Stotesburys was pushed against the walls to make room for sculptures that were carved before Christ was born. It was a juxtaposition of breathtaking sadness and beauty. The house, which had been built as a monument to frivolous vanity, a place for drinking champagne and gossiping about high society, had found its redemption. In its final years, it served a noble purpose. It became the shield that protected beauty from the ugliness of war. For 3 years, the house held its breath. The staff was minimal, just a few curators and guards, their footsteps echoing loudly on the marble floors as they made their rounds with flashlights, checking the humidity gauges, ensuring the ghosts of the past didn't disturb the treasures of the present. But wars end. In 1945, the guns fell silent. The danger passed. The trucks returned. The crates were loaded up. The Raphael, the Rembrandts, and the Goyas were taken back to the lights of New York City. The steel shutters were taken down. The guards left. The dogs were kenneled. And Whitemarsh Hall was left truly, completely naked. It had lost its owners. It had lost its purpose. It had lost its soul. Now, it stood on the hill, a hollow concrete shell, waiting for the vultures to arrive. Chapter 22, The Unwanted Orphan. In 1946, the final thread was cut. Eva Stotesbury died in Florida. With her death, the last human connection to the glory days of Whitemarsh Hall was extinguished. The house was now an orphan, and it was an orphan that nobody wanted. The children and grandchildren of the Stotesburys looked at the estate and saw only a financial black hole. The taxes were crushing. The maintenance was impossible. The Gilded Age was ancient history, and no modern millionaire in the post-war world wanted to live in a museum that required 50 servants to function. It was a white elephant, magnificent, but useless. So the unthinkable happened. The palace that cost millions to build was sold for pennies on the dollar. It was purchased by the Pennsylvania Salt Manufacturing Company. They did not want a home. They wanted a laboratory. For a few strange years, the estate suffered a humiliating identity crisis. The great limestone halls were converted into research facilities. Scientists in white lab coats set up beakers and test tubes in rooms where dukes once slept. Bunsen burners replaced the crystal chandeliers. The smell of chemicals replaced the scent of roses. But even a chemical corporation could not justify the cost of the upkeep. The roof began to leak. The heating system, that ravenous coal eater, was too expensive to run. The landscape, once the envy of America, became a burden. Pensalt ran the numbers and came to the same conclusion as Eva Stotesbury. The house was a parasite. In the 1,960 seconds, they moved out. But they didn't sell it to a new owner. They simply left. They took their equipment, they turned off the lights, and they left the gates unlockable. The house was abandoned. There were no guards. There were no caretakers. Whitemarsh Hall, the fortress of steel and stone, was now defenseless against its two greatest enemies, the slow, grinding march of nature and the cruelty of man. Chapter 23, The Kingdom of Weeds. The death of a house like Whitemarsh Hall does not happen in an instant. It is not a heart attack, it is gangrene. It is a slow, festering necrosis where the structure is stripped of its dignity, layer by layer, until only the skeleton remains. After the scientists departed in the 1,960 seconds, the estate entered its ghost years. For nearly 2 decades, Whitemarsh Hall sat on its hill, unguarded and unloved, a blind giant staring out over the sprawling suburbs of Philadelphia with 200 broken eyes. The destruction began at the top. Sometime in the late 60s, scavengers climbed onto the vast slate roof. They were not looking for history, they were looking for copper. They stripped away the flashing, the intricate metal seals that kept the building watertight, peeling the skin off the corpse to sell it for scrap metal for a few $100s. It was a fatal wound. Without its skin, the house drank the rain. Water is a patient assassin. It trickled down through the attic, soaking into the massive oak beams that held up the ceilings. It ran down the interior walls, turning the silk damask wallpaper into black, molding pulp. It pooled on the famous parquet floors, causing the wood to swell, buckle, and explode upward in jagged waves, as if the floor itself was screaming in pain. Outside, the discipline of Jacques Robert's landscape design collapsed into chaos. Nature, which had been beaten back by an army of gardeners for 40 years, finally declared victory. The Grand Allée vanished under a sea of thorns. Vines, thick as a man's arm, crawled up the limestone walls, choking the statues of Greek gods until they disappeared into the greenery. The rose gardens became a jungle, burying the pathways where kings once walked. The house was dying from the inside out. It was a slow, agonizing decomposition. The grand ballroom, once reflecting the light of 1,000 candles, now only reflected the gray light of the moon through shattered windows, casting long, twisted shadows across a floor that was slowly turning back into dirt. Chapter 24, the domain of vandals. But the elements were kind compared to the humans. By the 1,970 seconds, Whitemarsh Hall had transformed from a private residence into a dark legend. To the teenagers of Wynmore and Springfield, it wasn't a historical landmark or a masterpiece of architecture. It was the castle. It was the ultimate test of courage. Every Friday night, a ritual took place. Groups of kids would park their cars at the bottom of the hill, cut through the rusted chain-link fences, and hike up the overgrown driveway. They came armed with flashlights, spray paint, and sledgehammers. Imagine the surrealism of this scene. The great hall, where Edward Stotesbury once greeted the President of the United States, was now littered with crushed beer cans and cigarette butts. The limestone fireplaces, carved by Italian masters who spent years perfecting a single curve, became target practice for rocks. The walls, once adorned with portraits of dukes, were now covered in crude graffiti. Names like Steve and Zeppelin were spray-painted in neon orange over the delicate cream-colored boiserie. It was a desecration. It was a clash of civilizations. The grandeur of the Gilded Age was being dismantled by the apathy of the disco era. But the most haunting stories came from the tunnels, the underground service tunnels. Once the arteries of the house had become the throat of hell. With the electricity cut off for years, these tunnels were pitch black. Due to the leaking roof and rising groundwater, they had flooded. The water was stagnant, black, and freezing cold. Teenagers dared each other to walk into the darkness. They floated on old tires through the flooded basements, their flashlight beams dancing over rusted pipes and rotting furniture that had been thrown down the stairs. Urban legends began to breed like mold in the damp air. They whispered that Eva Stotesbury still walked the upper halls, a white figure weeping for her lost emeralds. They said that if you stood in the ballroom at midnight, you could hear the faint, distorted sound of a piano playing a waltz, echoing from a room that no longer had a floor. Most of these were lies, born from the overactive imaginations of suburban kids. But the reality was scarier than any ghost story. The reality was that the house was becoming a death trap. Floors were rotting through. A misstep in a dark hallway could send an explorer plummeting 3 stories down into the basement. Massive chunks of plaster, weighing 50 pounds, would randomly detach from the ceiling and crash to the ground with the force of a bomb. Whitemarsh Hall had become a memento mori, a giant skull on the landscape, grinning at the modern world, reminding everyone that all empires, no matter how rich, eventually turned to dust. But the dust was taking too long to settle. The neighbors complained about the eyesore. The police complained about the trespassing. And the developers looked at the land and saw dollar signs. The giant had been dying for 40 years. It was time to put it out of its misery. Chapter 25. The Execution and the Legacy. April 1980. Spring had returned to Pennsylvania. The dogwoods were blooming, and the air was filled with the promise of new life. But on the hill at Whitemarsh, preparations were being made for a murder. The final verdict had been delivered not by a judge, but by a calculator. For years, preservationists had begged, pleaded, and screamed to save the estate. They argued that destroying Whitemarsh Hall was an act of cultural vandalism, equivalent to bulldozing a pyramid to build a strip mall. But the developers looked at the ledger, and the math was cold and unyielding. The land, the dirt itself, was worth millions. The house was a liability. In the unsentimental eyes of the modern economy, the Versailles of America was nothing more than a pile of expensive trash blocking the path of progress. The permits were signed, the fences were reinforced, and then the executioners arrived. They didn't come with axes. They came with yellow diesel monsters, cranes, bulldozers, and wrecking balls rolled up the long driveway, their treads crushing the overgrown weeds where the royal roses used to bloom. They surrounded the limestone giant like a pack of wolves cornering a wounded stag. The demolition of Whitemarsh Hall was not a simple job. It was a war. Horace Trumbauer had built this house to last for 1,000 years. He had constructed a skeleton of riveted steel beams, the same steel used in the skyscrapers of Manhattan, and encased it in feet of solid rock and concrete. When the first wrecking ball swung through the air and struck the west wing, it didn't smash through. It bounced off. A hollow boom echoed across the valley, sounding like a cannon shot. The house shuddered, but it stood firm. It was as if the old building was refusing to kneel. The demolition crew realized they were not tearing down a house. They were dismantling a fortress. It took days of relentless pounding. The steel cables of the cranes strained and groaned under the tension. Slowly, agonizingly, the facade began to crack. Imagine standing there, watching the end of an era. The Great Hall, the room where Henry Ford had smoked cigars and discussed the future of the engine, was sheared in half. For a brief moment, the interior was exposed to the sunlight like a dollhouse. You could see the shredded remains of the Gobelin tapestries flapping in the wind. You could see the fireplace on the second floor hanging over the abyss. And then, with a sound that shook the ground for miles, the roof gave way. The crash was apocalyptic. Thousands of tons of limestone, marble, slate, and steel collapsed inward. A massive cloud of white dust rose into the sky, choking the air. It settled on the trees, on the grass, and on the cars of the workers, coating everything in a ghostly layer of powder. It was the cremated remains of the Gilded Age. The violence continued for weeks. The beautiful parquet floors were splintered into kindling. The marble columns were toppled and crushed into gravel. The tunnels, the secret veins of the house, were collapsed and filled with dirt. By the summer of 1980, the hill was silent. The limestone mountain was gone. The horizon was empty. The monster had been erased. Epilogue: the tombstones of Winmore. If you drive to that location today, you will find a pleasant upper-middle-class subdivision called Stotesbury Estates. It is a nice place. The driveways are paved. The lawns are green. Families live there and comfortable. Modern townhouses with central air conditioning and cable TV. It is the victory of the practical over the poetic. But the site is not entirely at peace. At the entrance to the neighborhood, looming over the Honda Civics and the delivery trucks, stand two massive limestone pillars. They are the remnants of the original gatehouse. They are scarred, weathered, and impossibly large compared to the houses around them. They stand like tombstones, marking the grave of a giant. Walk into the woods behind the townhouses, and you might find more bones. Buried in the brush, half swallowed by the earth, are fragments of balustrades, broken steps from the garden, and pieces of stone fountains. Local residents say that when they dig in their gardens to plant tulips, they sometimes hit something hard. They pull up pieces of white marble or shards of crystal from a chandelier that shattered 50 years ago. Whitemarsh Hall is gone, but its lesson remains etched into the landscape. It is a lesson about the arrogance of ambition. Ned and Eva Stotesbury tried to build something eternal. They poured their fortune, their souls, and their identity into stone, believing that they could buy immortality. They thought that if they built it big enough, the world would never forget them. But in the end, they were just tenants. We are all just tenants. Time is the only landlord, and eventually, everyone gets evicted. The music has faded, the lights are out, the party's over, and on the quiet hill in Pennsylvania, only the wind remembers the name of the queen who once lived in the Palace of Ghosts. The end.